I'm pleased to introduce the first speaker, Cahan, who is the director of the Harris Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And Jean has worked on a number of issues also in the water-food domain, and will specifically discuss here ways to explain and resolve water security tensions in the Middle East, looking at a social perspective. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jean. What do you have?
I don't have anything.
Oh, I will put this back.
I'm just doing the old style lecturing. Well, every chance I get, like Ellie Rekes, I jump up and down about the underrepresentation of the humanities. I'm a philosopher, and so my task here this morning is to try and display, to show what possible help philosophy can be to the broader projects around water security. Anthropology, literature, history, religious studies, the other humanities fields are obviously also extremely important, but my personal interest happens to be philosophy, and I also think that these other fields, anthropology and literature and so on, often without knowing it, make very deep philosophical assumptions. So philosophy is very much imbricated in the other fields, and that's why I think it's important to have a philosophical perspective. Before I get into it further, though, I'd very much like to thank everyone at Northwestern, all the units involved, for this really interesting invitation and for the very warm welcome. I really appreciate it. Issues in regard to Middle East water security that incorporate philosophical concepts, and I'm not going to really explain what philosophy does. I hope that will become clear, and we can talk about it a little bit in the discussion if need be. Issues in regard to Middle East water security that incorporate philosophical concepts include the nature of power, the nature of national identity and nationalism, objective and subjective interests. What does it even mean to have an objective interest? The definition of needs, the definition of rights, concepts of justice and fairness, the nature of culture, and the question of how social norms get formed. And finally, also the nature and possibility of cooperation. These are all philosophical topics. Today, I'm going to consider 3 examples of issues relating to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and how philosophy gets drawn into those. And I'm going to look at power, identity, and cooperation. In general, I will be trying to show that philosophy's main function is to clarify thinking, and it is emancipatory only in that sense. I am not claiming that it has any kind of redemptive function, which some philosophers would be likely to do. I'm very doubtful as to whether philosophy itself or the worlds which it studies are tending towards any sort of end state in which mind is reconciled with itself, or however you want to put it. Even less am I suggesting that political or military decision makers in the heat of a conflictual situation stop and study what philosophers would have to say. That would be absurd. Rather, philosophy's contribution lies in discussions within epistemic communities, think tanks, universities, research institutions of various kinds, and therefore in a very long-term and indirect influence on policymakers and domestic political coalitions. So I'll begin with the first concept, that of power, or as is often expressed today, the concept of hegemony. I begin with a widely recognized feature of Middle East water issues, that of power asymmetry between Israel and the territories governed by the Palestinian Authority, although we could equally well choose examples such as Egypt versus Ethiopia or Turkey versus Iraq. There is no disputing the superiority of the material and military resources currently available to Israel. How these material conditions came about is itself an enormous topic for historical investigation and a contentious matter. But in the last 10 years or so, another dimension has been added to power analyses, namely that of ideational power. This is especially noticeable in the work of the London School of Water Security Studies and the work, for example, of Mark Zeytoun and Jan Selby. Zeytoun, in a well-known book called Water and Power, returns again and again to the proposition that, in addition to its enormous material power, Israel has managed to construct a weighty form of ideational power by imposing certain narratives, discourses, and dominant ideas. In this way, it has achieved ideational dominance not only in the Middle East, but in the international community, in important Western donor countries, and in the communications media. Zeytoun and others use the word hegemony to describe this supposed situation of ideational dominance. The word is borrowed from the prison writings of the early 20th century Italian communist thinker Antonio Gramsci. According to Gramsci, hegemony is a structure of informal or indirect dominance in contrast to the direct dominance and coercive powers of the state, such as the prison system. Zeytoun seeks to demonstrate the existence of Israel's ideational power or hegemony through three examples. The first is Israel's apparent ability to halt Lebanon's Wazani Springs project in 2002. The second is Israel's master planning of the Palestinian water sector, and this in turn is evidenced by the water annex to the Oslo II Accords of 1995, as well as Israel's ability to shut down the Hadera Tulkarem project. The third example of Israel's hegemony is Israel's relentless discursive focus on needs, not rights, with regard to water. In all three cases, Zeytoun maintains, Israel has managed to gain the upper hand in the world's discourse about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It has been able to represent itself as well-intentioned and the Palestinians as obstructionist. I'm not going to be able to go into each of the three examples that Zeytoun gives. I'm just going to mention briefly the Wazani Springs dispute. There is, first of all, an empirical question of what happened during the events of the Wazani Springs issue. As Hussein Amory has shown, he's with us this morning, it is practically impossible to obtain reliable information on this issue or on the broader topic of Israel's intentions with regard to the Litani River. Both the Lebanese and Israeli militaries regarded the area as supremely sensitive and would not allow investigators to enter the zone. Reports such as were produced, I believe, tended not to find evidence of Israel's diversion of the Litani River. At one point, the United Nations sent investigators and appealed to both sides to de-escalate their rhetoric. And the issue of rhetoric is going to come up presently. Admittedly, Ariel Sharon was much more vehement than the Lebanese government, but while he threatened war, no military action was in fact taken. The pumping station was completed and it functioned until Israel destroyed it in the course of the Second Lebanon War of 2006. The point here is that the project was not shut down, as Zeytoun argues, by rhetorical and ideational advantages or superiority of the Israeli narrative. It was shut down in response to a very material threat emanating from southern Lebanon. Even if one argued that Israel's internal security debates resulted in the predominance of a discourse that advocated using the war as an opportunity to destroy the pumping station, that would be a very different level of discourse from the one presumed by Zeytoun. But one must also question the applicability of Gramscian hegemony theory, and I can't emphasize enough how pervasive Gramsci's work is in recent humanities work on the Middle East and, on other issues as well. This theory carries over ideas from the particular context of Italian communist politics in the 1920s to an entirely different region and set of problems. Is this plausible? Interestingly, it is, but in a way quite different from how Zeytoun and like-minded scholars insist. For Gramsci, it was both a fact and a norm, that is, an ideal, that there be numerous hegemonies present in a society, because he believed that what he called common sense, or what we would call popular opinion, arises out of innumerable individual efforts at self-enlightenment and political idea formation. Everyone is a philosopher, according to Gramsci, and to try to repress this reflective capacity and the exchanges that take place around the water cooler or in the piazza is both dangerous and impossible. It is or should be well recognized that there has long been a multiplicity of discourses in Israeli society. To what extent this exists also among Palestinians is less obvious. I find it interesting that the poet Mourid Barghouti, a member of the very large Palestinian Barghouti clan, writes in I Saw Ramallah, quote, "I do not understand the concept of unconditional support. I cannot condone every decision of the tribe," end quote. Nonetheless, Barghouti's work has become iconic for intellectuals interested in the topic of Israeli hegemony. Indeed, Zeytoun's and others' usage of the notion of hegemony serves to bolster Palestinian national consciousness by continuing a mental stance that regards Israel as the permanent enemy. I would suggest that Israel's ideational hegemony is more myth than reality. Similarly, doubt may be cast on the reality of Egyptian hegemony in the Nile River basin. Whatever Egypt's power in the past, that is now being fairly successfully challenged by the weaker riparians. Ethiopia, Burundi, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Sudan have jointly been able to negotiate new agreements on sharing the Nile and have demonstrated that the power of a hegemon can be challenged. I also think we should be, I'm going to switch now from the question of power and what is the nature of power, material or ideational, to the question of national identity. I think we should be cautious in our view of society as an arena for the contest of ideas. Certainly, internally within any given society, there is the greatest value to what the philosopher John Stuart Mill called the marketplace of ideas. But in the international sphere, the mental image of conflict resolution through exchanges of ideas that what many Western academics have also derives not from the Anglo-American liberty tradition, but from the philosophical tradition of 19th century German idealism. This has been enormously influential, but I'm not sure how fruitful it is. The philosophical tradition I am referring to begins with Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, 1807, and a certain passage there called the master-slave dialectic. In this passage, very, very famous, through the struggles between master and slave, the slave gradually becomes stronger and the master gradually weaker. Initially, there was a struggle to the death, as the master sought not merely to exploit the slave, but more importantly, to obtain recognition of his own superiority. But over time, with the slave refusing this recognition and continuing to work, while the master becomes increasingly decadent, the slave succeeds in liberating himself. Thus, the very identities of master and slave are transformed through the dialectic or dialogic conversational process. Karl Marx would later apply this dialectic to the struggle between socioeconomic classes. Two very important Jewish philosophers, Franz Rosenzweig and Martin Buber, were influenced by it to form their own dialogic theories of man's relation to God. More recently, in the last third of the 20th century, the Hegelian dialectic became the basis for what is known as recognition theory, a way of interpreting relations among cultures and arguing for multiculturalism. As part of this trend, Hegel's dialectic was taken up by the contemporary philosopher Jürgen Habermas in his theory of communicative action. This theory places tremendous hope in humans' capacity to have rational, deliberative conversations on all matters. Habermas also appropriated the model of the natural sciences and how discussion takes place there. This Habermasian paradigm lies deep in the thinking of those who advocate dialogue between political opponents. It is a very broad project seeking to affect the culture or the thinking of entire societies. But one must raise the question, is a Habermasian type of dialogue seeking to change nations' ideas and identities really likely to produce solutions to the problems of the Middle East? The distinguished British philosopher Bernard Williams, a leading moral philosopher of the 20th century, late in life wrote quite extensively about political realism, and he argued as follows, quote, "We know that our and others' convictions have to a great degree been the product of previous historical conditions and of an obscure mixture of beliefs, passions, interests, and so forth. Moreover, the joint outcome of these things has often been that political schemes had perverse results. This means, among other things, that we take certain kinds of views of our allies and of our opponents. But remembering the historical conditions, we should not think that what we have to do is simply to argue with those who disagree." What he means here, end quote, what he means here is that we cannot treat situations of profound political disagreement as a conversation or Socratic dialogue in which we are all simply seeking the truth. The point of an exchange between political opponents is not only to arrive at the claim that one side or the other side is morally right or wrong, philosophically considered. The goal is to arrive at a political decision and a ground for political action. The result may be one in which one party to the exchange is regarded or may regard itself as having lost. So that's the Bernard Williams political realist position. The utility of underscoring, in case you think, well, this is all a discussion among philosophers, the utility of underscoring the idea of definitive winners and losers has just recently been discussed by certain strategists on the Jewish right. Daniel Pipes of the Middle East Forum, along with an emerging congressional caucus. Martin Sherman has gotten into this debate as well. He's with the Israeli Strategic Studies Institute. Pipes is advocating what I would call a ruthless policy of deterrence to underscore Israeli victory and Palestinian defeat. It is a policy which includes cutting off water, fuel, and electricity to both of the Palestinian entities, with the goal of instilling a recognition that Israel is not going away and emphasizing the irreversibility of the 1967 defeat. I think this is completely unrealistic. A sense of history and acquaintance with Arab and Palestinian literature and poetry should provide a restraining note. In general, and not just in the Israeli-Palestinian case, the awareness of loss or the finality of defeat is far from momentary and extremely bitter. It is, in fact, a principal cause of many conflicts that are still ongoing. The Palestinians, whatever internal critique they may be capable of, may never get past the original evil of the European Jews' migration to Palestine. As we saw in the 1990s, the Serbs cannot get past the 700-year-old loss of the Battle of Kosovo. Moreover, many of these ancient but ongoing conflicts involve some body of water which is seen as central to the identity of the parties involved. The Nile to the Egyptians, later the Suez Canal, the Jordan River to the Palestinians, the Danube River to the 17-plus European countries, which only now, after generations of conflict, cooperate relatively peaceably through the International Commission on the Danube. Nonetheless, while historical narratives, especially the Israeli and the Palestinian, will probably never be reconciled, I do think philosophers can help by continuing to lay out or to put forward different conceptions of justice and fairness. From Plato's famous question as to why one should be just at all, to the American John Rawls's theory as to how to construct a fair social contract, to the Indian philosopher Amartya Sen's conception of economies which support human capabilities, a great deal of thought has already been given to rights, needs, equitable use, historical use, and so on. These are, of course, mainly Western or Western-influenced ideas, and as such may be of dubious value in the eyes of non-Westerners, but to my mind that is not a reason to abandon this line of thought. And finally, I'm going to turn to the issue of cooperation. The London School of Water Security Studies, which I mentioned at the beginning in relation to hegemony, has also been deeply suspicious of efforts at cooperation on water security, seeing the very term cooperation as a piece of language concealing exploitative and coercive intentions. How might one reply to such a hermeneutic of suspicion, as the philosophers call it, which again rests on presumed hegemony? One reply to the hermeneutic of suspicion is quite pragmatic. One can begin actual meetings and negotiations, attempt to coordinate efforts to manage transboundary waters at the basin level or below. One can seek scientific technological solutions and share data from highly advanced mapping techniques and so on. Ben Gurion University, the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies are prime examples of this type of exchange. While I anticipate a derisory laugh, I'm going to call these relatively practical gestures the answer of solidarity. The derisory laugh will come because to Palestinians, an offer of a technical solution such as desalinated water will usually appear to be an attempt to move the conversation away from the fundamental question of rights. And it will also appear negated by the equally pragmatic tendency of the Israeli government to limit or cut off the water supply to Gaza, the West Bank, under certain circumstances. Nonetheless, offers of coordination or cooperation on this level, scientific, technological level, are pragmatic as opposed to philosophical or conceptual, and I think not all that difficult to carry out as an act of human solidarity. A philosophical response, however, to the human hermeneutic of suspicion, in which every thought, act, or gesture is interpreted as having some perverse motivation, is much more difficult. Why do I say this? We are currently in a philosophical environment in which 2 times 2 is not necessarily 4. Or if it is 4, that's because some group of human beings have found it socially expedient to stipulate this. The notions of truth and truthfulness, as most Western philosophers until recently understood it, has been greatly undermined. The very statement that a scientific or technological solution is available for something should, in the eyes of many academics, be treated with skepticism. Thus, Samer Alatu, for example, I think he's at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, quote, "Scientific consensus is a techno-political arrangement that hides from view the inherent uncertainties in scientific practice on the one hand, and the very relations of power that produce it on the other. If this is the case, is the role of science to speak truth to power? What if science and what we take as scientific facts are already the results of relations of power and political maneuvering? How then can we trust science itself in the process?" Alatu, either consciously or unconsciously, is following a Gramscian line of analysis here. Gramsci too believed that science is a political activity inasmuch as it transforms men and makes them different from what they were before. In several scholarly papers, Alatu has sought to show a relationship between water and Jewish identity, focusing especially on the Mandate period up to 1948. He argues that the notion of water abundance became dominant among Zionist water experts, and this in turn affected immigration and settlement policy. To this type of scholarly analysis, a pragmatic response is clearly not sufficient. Alatu's main thesis is not one which can even be discussed in empirical terms. At issue here at bottom are the aims of philosophical movements, such as deconstructionism, critical constructivism, and the remnants of historical materialism, which place into doubt the legitimacy of contemporary scientific methods and traditional ideas of cause and effect. And I've lost my last page. Basically the conclusion was that in order to change people's preferences as to patterns of consumption, as to which sector of the economy in any given nation should be prioritized, which energy needs should be prioritized. In order to change preferences in these respects, philosophical as well as other humanities approaches will have to be brought to bear, because even if the concept of truth is under attack, as we in this room all know, water scarcity is not a fiction. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean, for providing this framework for assessment of some of the central issues of use of water, conflict around water, and potential cooperation around water. And I'm sure everyone in the room recognizes that these issues are not only pressing in the Middle East, but also here in the United States. All right, so we have around 10 minutes for questions, so I'm happy to open this to the audience for questions for Jean.
Hey, thanks. Michael Taboris from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. So toward the beginning, you talked a little bit about moving away from, you talked a little bit about the rights discussion as the primary, having, people suggesting we're sort of moving away from that. I wonder, though, whether when we look at actual cases of conflict resolution and we look at what happens when groups that are competing for resources negotiate over them, often the discussion starts with rights, but then frequently moves to interests, moves to needs, and then ultimately to interests. And we don't, just as an empirical matter, see a lot of agreement until they hit the discussion of interests particularly. Is there a sense in which either insisting on that the discussion be framed in terms of rights forestalls cooperation, or is just an indication that we're sort of early in like very, very early in the process?
Well, the issue of rights versus needs is especially strong in the Palestinian-Israeli issue. It's probably less strong, let's say, as between Nebraska and Kansas, where there are also very heated debates. And I would say until 1995, there was just no getting around that. And Palestinians generally argued, we're not even going to get into a discussion here until our rights to the mountain aquifer and to withdraw water from the Jordan River are acknowledged. And that was, there was just no conversation to be had without that. During the Oslo process, and the Israelis kept saying, well, let's wait, let's leave the rights issue. You know, it's just a conceptual issue. We'll do that when we get to the final comprehensive plan. Let's just focus on what you need day to day, what we all need day to day. And so they just kept talking past each other. In the Oslo process, because there was a track that was dealing with the larger political conflict, the water people were able to start talking, and they got around this confused vocabulary or contradictory vocabulary by adopting a phrase called rightful allocation. And they did that on purpose. I forget who came up with that phrase, but the whole purpose was to kind of mention rights in there, but not rights exactly, just rightful. And so that helped the Palestinians, and it also helped the Israelis, who were preoccupied with really specific allocations. And that has also happened in other conventions and treaty negotiations. I forget, the 1997 UN Convention on Non-Navigational Uses of Water. I believe there was also some kind of linguistic creative ambiguity, as they put it, that got around this rights versus needs conflict. But at the deepest level, it's not resolved. When there's a will to get around it, they can find language that helps with negotiation and compliance. But when there's no will, then each side is back to its own vocabulary.
So on this, I would like to emphasize this is a completely global issue. You have the same challenges faced by the United Nations, where the right to water was established as part of the Millennium Development Goals, but there generally aren't legal frameworks or implementation frameworks in place today to guarantee those rights. So you always have this conflict between actual and perceived needs conflicting with this general established right to fundamental resources. Then we had another question here.
And I would just add that I think the Israelis need to be more understanding of what this means sort of spiritually to the Palestinians. The Palestinian rights language, it's not only a legal issue, I think it's a spiritual issue because they feel connected to the Jordan River and the mountain aquifer. There's something deeper going on here than a legal issue.
I would like to ask a follow-up question on this. I mean, I'm very fascinated. Ruth Gavison, I'm from the Crown Family Center and the Hebrew University. And I'm interested in the relationships between philosophy as a framework for thought and these conflicts. And I wonder whether philosophy is trying to explain the conflicts and shed lights on their perseverances, or whether there is an international relations type of atmosphere that says we should try to seek to find ways of helping the partners to get out of their frameworks and maybe get to the issues that divide them in a way that may be conducive to the end or the mitigation of the conflict. And this is a very serious issue because, as you said, sometimes in a conflict you don't want to cooperate because you think, maybe rightly so, that cooperation may be a deference of justice. So this is a complicated issue. I want to go to this rights versus interest issue because I think it's critical not only for water and not only for Israel-Palestine, but for a rhetoric that applies to all of us in situations of conflict. And I want to ask you whether you don't think that hegemony and rights discourse is in fact a discourse that in itself does not encourage people to understand the various interests of the other sides, because they really try to persuade each of the sides that they shouldn't compromise, but they should stand on their rights, and their rights is an entitlement that does not depend on the interests of the other side. And this is something that is basically very conflictual in the frameworks that we ourselves are imposing on conflicts that is not very conducive to mitigating them.
I agree completely. And I think this talk about hegemony, which, as I said, is quite pervasive, this is to be found in literature that is more European-oriented. I mean, Anglo-American philosophers are not terribly into that. They have much narrower interests. But I think the concept of hegemony is a conversation stopper. I mean, if you say to somebody, well, Israel is the hegemon here, end of story, and nothing that Israel suggests or offers is innocent. So I agree, hegemony is a conversation stopper. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thinking about, well, what is really involved? Is there such a thing as hegemony? I mean, I think we do need to think about it and talk about it, but I agree that by itself, it does stop the conversation. And so it's not helpful.
Oh, yes. Andrew, you're welcome to ask a question.
I actually did some field research on this issue when we did work on the Red Dead Sea to try to understand, this is a good project, what's going on, what are the obstacles to cooperation. And one of the issues that appear to be the obstacle is rights versus needs, right? So to appreciate it, you have to, Miriam Loewy's book on the water of politics.
Yes.
So
Water and Power.
Water and power.
Yeah.
So water is getting caught up with, it's an issue of low politics getting caught up with the issue of high politics. So for the Palestinians, they need to have simply their rights recognized, right? To them, if you give me water,
Well, go ahead.
Israel. Yeah, just let me finish, then you can correct me.
Yeah,
So
I'm not correcting, I'm just amending.
So if you give me water without recognizing my rights, you
Yes.
in fact take away my rights.
Yes.
So bottom line, I just want rights.
Yeah.
So for Israel, the fear is if I give you rights,
Yes.
then I have to recognize your rights to other things. Then I have to recognize your rights to statehood. I have to recognize the rights of refugees to return. I don't want to talk about that.
Right.
Let's move it to the side. Let's just negotiate water and ignore high politics.
Yes.
So that way, it's for the benefit of Israel to avoid the issue. So
Yes.
what's happening is, although it's perceived by the negotiators as an issue of low politics, and they want to push off till the end, just like you said, negotiating over rights and allocations, fixed allocations. So it's an easy way to get out of it and avoid it.
Well, I wouldn't say it's an easy way, but it is a way
It's for
to.
them, it's easier than talking
But
about
in the meantime, the reality on the ground is, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, that there isn't enough water. And if Palestinians would accept more desalinated water, then, if they would set aside the rights issue provisionally, They might be but it's very difficult to do. It's very difficult for both sides to do. And
so here we have some discussion between our speakers, and you'll hear many of these themes. It's very good. But you'll hear many of these themes addressed throughout the day by different speakers. So there's a question here and then here.
All the questions relating to the aquifer that we have in the West Bank, the Litani River, and all the reasons for war or division for all the other speakers. I mean, I'll ask these questions later. But I have one question that might be relating to you, which everyone is ignoring, is the effects of the southern Mediterranean by the Aswan Dam, by the Suez Canal, and I'm following it very carefully in the science sections of Haaretz. For instance, right now they talked about invasive species that come in through other fish. But the southern Mediterranean is pretty much dying, and it's affecting the Gaza Strip, and in a way it's affecting the pollution of the water if you're talking about desalinization along the Mediterranean.
yes, I was going to say that.
Yeah, I think that the question was a little bit compounded, but with respect to the impact on the Mediterranean, yes, there is an impact, and there are a lot of people that are concerned, but it's not just because of the Aswan Dam, it's not because of the canal, but it also because of overfishing in the Mediterranean over many, many years. It's also because of difficulty in terms of discharge into the Mediterranean. Not all countries, follow exactly the same procedure with regard to discharge, and so that's also an issue. So, but I'm not sure that we can, in this conference, really follow all the environmental issues that are associated with the Mediterranean per se. I will talk briefly, about the issue of desalination and the discharge, into the sea, and we can get into a discussion then.
So one last question, and then we'll move on to the next speaker.
I have a question to you. There is now a big term called science diplomacy that apparently succeeds where other forms of diplomacy failed. And this is being used now in the Middle East and between the Israelis and Palestinians. I wonder if you can give us some information on the collaborations that are going on the water issue between the water scientists in Gaza and the water scientists in Israel, and the collaboration on water that is going on between Jordan, Palestine, and Israel. If you can give us some light on these collaborations that are solving some of the problems.
I think this would be another good moment to turn it over to somebody from maybe Naphtali. I do know from friends and colleagues at the Arava Institute that they work with Jordanians and Palestinians daily. Really, I don't know what happens in regard to Gaza, and again, I think I need an Israeli here to help me. But in terms of water diplomacy, I'm not sure how successful it is. Of course, there is the Tufts School in Boston and Tufts, Harvard, I forget who else, they have water diplomacy programs, and they are working on conflict resolution techniques. I'm not in a position to say how successful they are. I mean, I think they're motivated by this, what I call this Habermasian dialogic framework, but conversation is always good and so on and so forth. But beyond that, I'm not sure how successful they are, but maybe Naphtali or Yoram?
Yeah, I was just going to briefly say, I'm not sure about scientists being politicians and to what degree they're involved, but I can tell you that there are ongoing conversations and collaborations between scientists, at least from my perspective, being, an Israeli American, There are ongoing efforts between what we do in the water sector, folks in Jordan, folks in Egypt, Gaza, even Saudi Arabia. But whether or not that translates into scientists being catapulted into prominence in the political arena, that's a different story.
Okay.
I think there are a lot, and this is Hussein Amri, I think there are a lot of individual collaborations between Arabs and Israelis, but I think at the state level, I'm not sure that there is a whole lot. Maybe 15 or 20 years ago, when there were peace negotiations, the Israelis and the Palestinians wanted to establish a research center. They couldn't agree on where to locate it, so they took it all the way down south to Oman. Right, so there is currently and has been a research center based in Muscat that does, I think, a lot of good work.
So we're going to have to move on in the interest of time. So I'm very happy to hear the extent of discussion. This is wonderful to engage everyone in the discussion. Well, let us thank our speaker, Jean, again.